Hello, welcome everyone to the Asia-Let's Partnership webinar. I thank you all and greetings of the day, and thank you for everyone for joining from different parts of the world. So today's webinar is about the green banks and the role of public sector banks for catalyzing private sector investments. In case you're unable to hear any of us, please let us know, and we will be able to fix the issue. On behalf of Asia-Let's Partnership, I would like to welcome you all for today's webinar, and let me announce some house rules for some time. So all of you who are attending as participants are in listen-only mode for some time. As we go on and call for the presenters, we will hear from them the different aspects of Green Bank and the examples from Australia and Africa today. And thereafter, we would open the webinar for question answers, and we would love to have an interaction with you and hear from you your questions as well as any recommendations on this context if you have. Next slide, please. So as you know, today's topic is about the role of public sector banks for catalyzing private sector banks. We have a good partnership with Green Bank Network, who has been pioneering and working in this aspect for long. Next slide, please. So today's agenda for discussion would be, I will be giving you a welcome note and introduction to Asia-Let's Partnership, and share with you a concept on Green Bank very lightly, and what could it mean for Asia. Thereafter, I will hand it over the presentations to Rob Young, who is an International Program Director for Coalition from Green Capital and has been pioneering on Green Bank concept in US for a long time. He would be speaking on effective tools to scale up private investment in the green infrastructure. Thereafter, we would hear from our colleagues from Australia and South Africa, respectively. So from Australia, we would have Andrew Johns and Bianca Sylvester from Clean Energy Finance Corporation, talking about their experience in Australia for setting up the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We also have Jonathan First, a lead specialist, Product Innovation Unit from Development Bank of Southern Africa, and he would share with us the experience at South Africa. We are delighted to have the speakers. Thank you. Let us know a little bit more about the Asia-Let's Partnership. Ritik, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the Asia-Let's Partnership is more about a voluntary regional network of individuals and organizations from public sector and non-governmental sectors. And we are here to design and promote implementing low-emission development strategies in Asia. And we have our counterparts also in Africa as well, as known as Africa-Let's Partnership. And at the global level, we have Global-Let's Partnership. In Asia, we are spread across East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Pacific region, which includes Australia and New Zealand. We run through the communities of practice, which are currently in energy, transport, finance, and subnational integration sectors. The main objective of ours of having this platform is to collaborate and coordinate and partner with people like you on the low emission developments across the region. And we use sharing tools, best practices, and facilitates different capacity building and awareness programs to strengthen our leadership. Next slide. Thank you. As you can see that we have various tools and platforms for engaging with you. We have fact sheets, brochures, and regular newsletters through which we interact with you. But apart from these, one of the bestest tool that we have introduced so far is the remote expert assistance on LEDs, and we call it REAL. And this is a no-cost technical assistance on LEDs, wherein we help you to analyze policies related issues spanning on topics such as agriculture, energy, forest, transportation, waste, finance, and climate resilience. This request is open to all government members who are part of LEDs. Next slide. Now moving on to today's topic on Green Bank and what it means to Asia. As we all know that to move from today's emission levels to what we have an ambitions of 1.5, we need a great transition from where we are today investing in low emission development to where we want to be. And in this regard, we also know that the public sector investment is not enough, and we need to collaborate with the private sector investment. And for that, we need some financial institutions, and such as the Green Bank, which are typically public or quasi-public institutions accelerating deployment of clean energy technologies, and particularly trying to bring in different financial techniques and market development tools for such partnerships. As in 2017, the Asia Development Bank has estimated that about 45 nations together in Asia needs about $3.6 trillion for climate change mitigation and adaptations until 2030. And to mark this achievement, we definitely need altogether the different green transformations that we could bring in as part of the government investment as well as bridge the climate investment gap. And hence we see the need for public capital as a seed in money to catalyze the private sector investment. This is not just in Asia, but across the globe. And herein, I would request my colleague Rob Youngs from Coalition of Green Capital to come in and share his view on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. Thank you and welcome. Thanks everyone for calling in. We've got a great presentation today. My name is Rob Youngs from the Coalition for Green Capital, and I'm really excited to hear from our two guest speakers today from Australia and from South Africa to hear about their real hands-on experience. And before we do that, I'm going to give some sort of high-level remarks on green banks and the evolution of this space, and sort of some definitions of what we're talking about here. So if we go to next slide here. So quickly on CGC, the Coalition for Green Capital, we're a nonprofit institution that we work with governments, state-owned entities, development banks, et cetera, to create dedicated green finance programs, sometimes called green banks. And so we've helped create a number of these institutions starting in the US and now internationally with projects in Africa, Latin America, working on creating these kind of dedicated green finance institutions. And to date, these institutions we've helped create have mobilized about $1.5 billion in climate and investment. And we work with a number of partners, as you can see, on this concept. Next slide, please. And so to frame up the discussion a little bit, I think Aditi touched on this, but to give you a sense, you know, the International Energy Agency estimates that we need about $2 trillion of investment to meet our Paris targets worldwide. Right now, we're doing about $500 billion in investment. With new policies and commitments coming out of the Paris agreements, looks like we're on track for another $400 billion, which is good. And then we did some calculations on new commitments from the development finance institutions, including what their targeted leverage ratios for private sector, and we're still quite short. So the long story short here is that there's another at least $1 trillion in annual investment needed to meet our low carbon infrastructure needs, and that's a large number. And I think, as Aditi alluded to, getting getting the private sector more involved in these is going to be critical. There simply just isn't enough public money to get the job done. So if we could go to the next slide. So just to give you a sense, we've got some numbers here in Asia, for instance, on the left-hand side. A lot of climate and resilient infrastructure is still mostly financed by public sources, particularly in Asia. In Indonesia, over 90%, in India, over 57% public financing. These are numbers from the Asian Development Bank. And then just to give you a sense, in Colombia here where we're working, these are numbers from the Department of National Planning, mapping out their needs, their investment needs under the Paris Commitment. Right now, it's still mostly, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, mostly public, with a smaller share of private, and they have about almost $800 million investment gap. They need to essentially flip from mostly public to mostly private, and they need to vastly increase the amount of investment. And so this is just an example, but this is not unique to Colombia. Most places need a large increase in investment, and they're sort of projecting that more private sector investment needs to come off the sidelines to help meet the targets. And so if we could go to the next slide. And so green banks or similar local, catalytic finance facilities are really positioned to help unlock local investment and international investment in green energy, and particularly taking on this catalytic role. And this is just a few kind of quotes from some leaders in the field here. And there's a lot of good work being done in the public sector banks already, but really, as we saw in the previous slide, the current commitments, even with leverage ratio included, still aren't enough to get us there. And so we do need really a seismic shift in some of the business models and cultures of public financing here that shifts more towards mobilizing and catalyzing private capital versus simply being a lender. And so green banks can be part of that equation. And here's another quote from a large pension fund manager talking about how governments or local financing institutions are doing their best when they can work on deal sourcing, development, and aggregation to create the kind of investment vehicles where institutional investors can put their money to work. Rather than competing over deals, how can public finance institutions like green banks, how can they facilitate deals? How can they crowd in private investment? And so that's kind of the core of what we'll be talking about today. Next slide. So what are green banks? Let's get into some definitions. And they're really, the secret about the green bank model is there is no one green bank model. I think that's fair to say. And we'll hear about a few different variations, and there's a lot of variations, but there's some central themes as well that are there. And so importantly, a green bank is a dedicated institution or institutional play. It can exist independently, or it can be created within an existing institution. These facilities tend to have a dedicated mandate, and they have a mission to crowd in private investment. So they're sort of judged on how much private sector capital they're animating. They also tend to have a specific geographic focus, located at the national or local level, and kind of becoming a market actor within that local ecosystem, and helping animate their, basically getting closer to the deals, getting closer to understanding the risk, and getting closer to the other financiers in that ecosystem so that they can play that kind of key catalytic role. And then importantly is the capitalization source, right? And so most green bank institutions to date have been capitalized with kind of pure public capital, but we're increasingly seeing models that use a blended approach where maybe private and public is money is in at the institutional level, and that money is then used to animate and crowd in at the project level as well. And so, you know, there's a lot of roles that a green bank can play in a local market. Can help arrange deals, help build local capacity as local institutions are created, and also by virtue of being a public or a quasi-public institution that's operating locally, these can act as an effective, essentially, feedback loop to the government on the enabling environment and policy and regulation, right? So having that proximity to local policymakers and regulators to kind of help shore up market rules and give feedback in real time on what's helping and what's hindering the market in terms of the policy environment. So if we can go to the next slide. So here's a high-level kind of stylized schematic of a green bank or a climate finance facility in an emerging market context. And so you can see capital coming in at the top there from a variety of sources or potential sources, including, you know, DFIs and multilateral development banks. Green climate funds and climate funds in general are also quite interested in this model, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with South Africa. Obviously, local, you know, national treasury money or local funding via co-financing from national development banks is a source, and also in the local context, carbon taxes and other sources have been revenue from carbon taxes sometimes been tapped to help capitalize and get going a green bank in a local market. And then you'll see you've got the green bank there and sitting in the middle, offering a range of kinds of investments and kinds of what we might call products or proactive structures that to help animate investment. So on the left-hand side, you see in this instance the green bank making an investment in a solar fund or a warehouse, with a commercial investor coming in at that sub-fund level, and then that fund, you know, kind of funding multiple projects. And there's similar kinds of products that you could roll out. And then on the far right-hand side, you'll see actually direct investment coming directly into the project with a co-investor at a project level. And so really, as I said, the tools vary wildly, but this is the general concept. So next slide. So this is just a snapshot of some of the existing green banks, some of the founding members of the Green Bank Network, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is a network of existing green bank and green finance institutions. But just to give you a sense of some of the magnitude here, and some of these numbers might be a little out of date as they're constantly doing new deals. But we've got examples from Connecticut, from Australia, from the UK Green Investment Bank before they were privatized, from the New York Green Bank, all focusing on using their public financing to mobilize private investment. And so you'll see the leverage ratios over on the right-hand side in terms of for every dollar invested from the public sphere being matched at least 1 to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times over in terms of private sector investment. And I think we can get into details later if folks are interested. I mean, leverage ratio is not the single goal here. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to measure it in terms of immediate leverage effect versus demonstration effect and ongoing effects. So there's these institutions shouldn't be reduced to a single number, but it kind of gives you a sense that they are very much focusing on their role as animators of the private sector. And I think the 6 founding members of the Green Bank Network have used a little over $10 billion to mobilize over $30 billion total investment in the approximate 5 or so years that they've been operating. And so just to give you a sense there. So if we can go to the next slide. And so there's an example in an emerging market context, which is hopefully helpful to some of the folks on the line. We'll get into this example a little more later with Jonathan in South Africa. But again, you can see the general concept here: multiple capital sources coming in, on the top to this new structure, climate finance facility, green bank program housed within the DBSA, and then a number of tools available to that climate finance facility to directly invest in projects and catalyze private sector investment with commercial funders and developers co-investing at the bottom. Next slide. And so there really is quite a range of tools that green banks can and do use. And we'll probably get into some examples here a little bit later. But high level, here's a few. So co-investments, doing a debt investment, either a senior debt investment or with an associated kind of credit enhancement to attract private sector investors. Direct investments, doing 100% of the debt, more for a long-term kind of demonstration effect goals. Bridge loans and kind of development phase, of a project is a place where some green banks play, particularly where there's some kind of regulatory uncertainty or timing issues around when capital needs are there. Equity investment is another one that we've seen, particularly in the Japan example of their green bank. Aggregation, and we can get into this in a bit, but essentially where there's small or medium-sized projects where the transaction costs are high relative to the ticket size, green banks can act a bit as an aggregator or can partner with a local aggregator to help project portfolios get to scale to the point where they can line up long-term financing, term financing, or even securitization. Partial guarantees and loan loss reserves is another tool that we've seen some institutions use, and particularly the Connecticut Green Bank. Green bonds, helping structure green bond. We've talked about securitization, but green bonds is a type of that. Helping structure them or providing anchor investments in issuances is a helpful role. And leading debt syndicates and is another, similar to another point we touched on earlier, but is another common tool that was particularly used by the UK Green Investment Bank and some of their early offshore wind deals. And so let's go to the next slide. And so I've got a few slides here that they're again stylized just to give you a sense of where green banks are coming in across the development phase of projects, right? So I've got 3 slides here where we can talk about early, middle, and sort of late stage in terms of as projects get developed, right? And so if you see the time in the project stage across the top, and then the green bank interventions coming in from the left-hand side. And so here's an example of a green bank acting as kind of a first mover and taking some early stage risk on projects. This is an example from New York Green Bank, community solar projects. There's basically new rules and regulations in the state of New York around community solar. It's very exciting. And there's some developers working to get that done, but it's a new space and it can be particularly slow. The internet connection process can be very slow. The rules are still kind of being finalized. And importantly, the utility has put in some requirements around relatively high interconnection down payments, essentially, that are required of developers in the early phase, even after, once projects have site control, et cetera. So this is development phase of these for project developers is a little bit difficult to bring in all the right capital here. And these are projects that are good projects. They have their spot in the interconnection queue. They have their permits. They have site control, but they need to make a large additional down payment. And then they have to sit around and wait. And so not particularly conducive to some of these pretty smaller developers. And so the Green Bank basically came in this situation and said, okay, we believe these are good projects. We're going to take more of a project finance kind of a view on these projects and actually underwrite to the value that they have given how far they are along, and line up this kind of 2-year bridge financing for that maximum 2 years that then is taken out once the project essentially moves forward and gets to the construction phase. And so just an example of them seeing a gap in the market, hearing from market participants, and filling a gap, and taking, digging into the details and taking a view on a market that others weren't at that point. So if we can go to the next slide. And so here's a more of a, in the middle, I guess, in the project development timeline. Is an example, for example, a biogas project or some other kind of, technology project. So this is a project that's gone through its development. It's already gotten, all the permits and everything, and it's construction finance. It's ready to be built. But it might be the case where this project is using a technology that has limited track record in that jurisdiction. Maybe it's been seen somewhere else in Europe or in another context, or it's using a slightly different, there's a lot of different kind of biogas types of technology out there using different feedstocks and different temperatures, and it's sort of can be a new technology for some folks. And so maybe it's perceived as new, or it's perceived as overly risky from a technology perspective. And also some of these projects can also come with multiple revenue streams, right? And so not only are they selling either the gas or the electricity, but they're also looking to sell, fertilizer, waste heat, and other things like that. And so just starts to become kind of complicated from a perspective of a private financer. And some of these offtake agreements might be, longer term than a commercial bank might want to take. And so in this example, a green bank coming in and providing either senior or subordinated debt directly to this project to round it out the capital stack and help pull in private investors into the deal, or offering a longer tenor on a project than a private investor might, in order to round out the capital in the stack and help animate and catalyze the private sector. So that's another example, kind of in the middle spectrum. And if we can go to the next slide. And in this example, kind of late stage or term financing, here we've got an example from the Connecticut Green Bank, helping deal with some regulatory risk and under a new regulatory scheme. Essentially, without getting into the details, there was a new policy that was rolled out in Connecticut, in the state of Connecticut, that allowed for property assessed clean energy. It's not worth getting into the details, but essentially it's a way to pay back debt for building upgrades, either solar energy efficiency upgrades on commercial buildings. It was a way to pay back loans on that via your property taxes. So it's kind of an innovative mechanism to add more certainty to the cash flows coming off of these projects, right? New scheme, it was seen as a little bit complicated. The state of Connecticut spent a lot of time setting up the regulation, thought it was all good, and that a lot of private players would immediately rush into the market, but that didn't happen. So the regulation was sort of sitting there, but no one wanted to be the first one to start financing projects under this new scheme, because it was just seen as sort of complicated and new. And so in that situation, the Connecticut Green Bank actually came in and financed the first round of projects, and did a number of these projects as the first mover, aggregated them into a portfolio of projects. And then once that portfolio was of a sufficient size, actually turned around and refinanced on the back end that deal. Actually, it was actually a securitization of those underlying assets. And now, and Connecticut held on to one of the tranches, again, to securitize, to credit enhance that pool of that portfolio of projects, held on to one of the lower tranches there. And so that was a successful example for that first round. And now at this point, the Connecticut Green Bank has managed to step more out of that market, and the private sector is kind of taking over and running with this new regulatory regime for these property assessed clean energy projects. So really another exciting kind of success case there. And so, yeah, let's go to the next slide. And so I want to touch on the Green Bank Network as well. So the Green Bank Network is the co-host for this webinar, and it's a growing hub for best practices. It's a membership organization launched with the 6 founding members, including the CEFC. It's launched at COP21 in Paris, and includes members from the UK, Japan, Connecticut, New York, and elsewhere, and is really kind of a good place to go for best practices or to learn more about the model. And so we host workshops and events under the Green Bank Network, including this year we're doing our event in Shanghai. For folks that are listening in Asia, if you're going to be at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance event in Shanghai, we'll be hosting our annual event alongside that event. So we hope to see you there. And in addition to those kinds of workshops and webinars and events, we also publish a number of kind of transaction takeaways and best practices on example deals that we've seen coming through our Green Bank Network members. Next slide, please. Again, lots of resources available out there, and so I'm just flashing a few interesting white papers on the screen. You can find all these on greenbanknetwork.org and a lot more resources. And you can also reach out directly to me or any of the other panelists here to learn more about it. Next slide. And for this Asia audience, I wanted to touch on just a few examples, and we are seeing a lot of growing interest, particularly in the region. I think it's an exciting development, and part of the reason that we're hosting our event in Shanghai this year. Just to highlight a few examples where CGC in particular is working, as we'll hear in a little bit, with the South Africa example, working with the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Also have a project in Colombia, working with the National Development Bank there. And seeing a lot of emerging interest from a number of other countries, right? And so Indonesia, we recently hosted a regional workshop in Indonesia on this green finance concept. Indonesia is now launching a SDG Indonesia 1 fund, which will have a green component and use a blended capital stack to catalyze private investment, which is very exciting. The Philippines, there's been some talk there, and they're interested in Green Bank. In Hong Kong as well, quite a lot of interest, and we'll be hearing about that at the Shanghai event later this month. And then India, another place where there's been a lot of interest, at IREDA and a number of other local institutions and partners there, and a new paper out from NRDC on green funds and green windows within some of the existing public finance institutions there, and thinking about tools and ways to be more catalytic toward the private sector. And so I think that gives a quick snapshot. There's actually a lot more going on in the Green Bank Network world and with CGC. If anyone's interested in learning more about green banks or any of these projects, or is interested in exploring if a green bank might make sense in their local jurisdiction, please reach out to me or any of the other panelists. I didn't put my contact information on here, but you can email the organizers and get our contact information. My name is Rob Youngs, and we'd love to hear from you and explore how we might work together. So I think with that I think that is the end of my presentation. I think we can go to next slide.
Thank you, Rob. That was really very insightful, and we have some house with some questions, but we would ask you at the later stage. And now I would like to call upon Andrew and Bianca to present their examples from Australia.
Thanks, Aditi, and thanks, Rob. It's Andrew Jauncey here from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Sydney, and I'm here with my colleague Bianca Sylvester. I think that was a great overview, Rob, and I think what you'll hear from us is some reinforcement of those principles in action down here in Australia. To begin with, I'm going to take you through just a little bit about our journey and the way that we operate here, and then I'm going to hand over to Bianca, who's going to give you some insights into what we've delivered, particularly in our most recent fiscal year, and how the greenback model has worked down here in Australia. Next slide. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or CEFC, our mission is to accelerate Australia's transformation towards a more competitive economy in a carbon-constrained world by acting as a catalyst to increase investment in emissions reduction. We have Australian 10 billion, which is about $7.5 billion US available to invest. We invest all over Australia. We're a government-owned institution that operates with an independent board. Our people are almost entirely drawn from the private sector, and those people are all seeking an opportunity to work with an enterprise with a higher public policy purpose. We seek to deliver innovative financial solutions to the market in order to address financing barriers using debt and equity. And our people are a unique mix of financial sector and clean energy experts that many private financial institutions are unable to replicate. And we now have a track record of delivering finance in the Australian market, which we'll tell you a bit more about. Next slide. But before we get there, I just want to go back and perhaps give you some insights into the level of, I guess, thinking and planning that went into creating the CEFC. And this journey started back in 2010, when the Australian Conservation Foundation published a report titled Funding the Transition to a Clean Energy Economy. And that report was really the impetus to start the journey towards creating the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. In 2011, the government then commissioned an independent expert review panel to make recommendations to government on the operating model of the CEFC. In 2012, the expert panel delivered a report to government, and that report identified 3 key principles to underpin the CEFC's existence and operation. The first of those principles was that we would have a clean energy focus. The second was we were to adopt a commercial approach. And the third is that we were to focus on addressing financial barriers. And those 3 principles really underpin everything that we do 5 years after being established. But I wanted to just draw the audience's attention to the importance of this expert panel review, because they consulted widely with industry, they sought feedback from many interested parties, they listened to what industry was telling them, and they took that feedback into account when they made their recommendations to government. And I think our success today is in large part due to the level of engagement and detail that expert panel went to with designing the CEFC. In July of 2012, there was legislation drafted and passed by the Australian Parliament to establish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. In August, the first board members were appointed, and then in December of the same year, the board appointed the first CEO, Mr. Oliver Yates. In April of 2013, the organisation was officially stood up, meaning we were able to operate and we were created as a corporation. And then we completed our first investment in July 2013. So you can see there that in getting the Clean Energy Finance Corporation set up, it wasn't something that was done in 6 months. It was a process that took some time, but I think because it was so well planned, it has really set us in good stead to deliver the results that we'll tell you about a little later. Next slide. So today's not going to be all about what. I'm also going to touch a little bit on how we go about it and how that has contributed to our success. So starting with our governance framework. So this diagram has a lot of boxes, but the key points here are that we are created and owned by the Australian government, as depicted in the top 2 boxes in this diagram. But our board is independent, and board members are appointed for fixed 5-year terms, and board members cannot be politicians or employees of the government. So they are truly independent. Our board has the responsibility to appoint the CEO and the executive, and the executive team have responsibility for the day-to-day operations of our organisation. We use committees fairly widely within our organisation for decision making in relation to investment, risk taking and managing of our portfolio. And this structure is similar to what you would observe in many private sector financial institutions, and this is by design. Next slide. So now I just want to touch on where we invest in the Australian economy and what really informs our strategy when we invest. And you can see here, and as Rob mentioned earlier, that green banks are set up with typically a climate change focus. And so when we think about investing, we look at the research and the science, and these pathways to decarbonisation are adopted from the excellent research done by ClimateWorks, both internationally and here in Australia. And so these pathways to decarbonisation really inform the way that we invest. Starting at the top there, so we recognise that transitioning to a low emissions economy means we've got to generate low carbon electricity. Australia currently depends significantly on coal generation for our electricity fleet, so we have a relatively high emissions intensity of the electricity sector. Energy efficiency is another area that will be critical in the transformation, and I noted with interest that the IEA came out with their latest report today, and again they highlighted energy efficiency as an area where perhaps hasn't been the progress as there has with renewables. Switching to electricity and cleaner fuels, so here we're talking electric vehicles or electrification of industrial processes away from fossil fuel-based generation sources we switch to electric vehicles, and then we're also looking at things like biofuels that can deal with applications that electrification isn't well suited for. And then lastly, we think about, what can we do? How can we invest in non-energy emissions or how can we invest in projects that reduce non-energy emissions? And that's largely around land use and agriculture. And just this year, we completed our first investment into a large-scale agricultural fund. Next slide, please. And I think Rob has already touched on in his presentation the multiple ways that green banks invest, and we would echo those sentiments. And the way that we go about it is we sort of categorise things into 4 broad categories. So there's direct investment, which is typically larger scale projects like large scale wind or solar projects that might be where we might be providing corporate debt or project finance. Then we have our indirect debt or co-financing or aggregation platforms. We have a number of terms for them, but these are really where we provide almost wholesale finance to other private sector financiers who then go and provide that finance at discounted rates to the smaller end of the market, to consumers, to make greener choices in their everyday lives, as well as small businesses. We also invest through funds. As we see, this is a fantastic way to leverage up our capital and to bring expertise and build capacity in green funds management. And finally, we also have established an innovation fund, which is a $200 million fund within the CEFC dedicated to venture capital style investments in Australian clean tech startups. And that's been operational for a couple of years now. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Bianca, who's going to talk to you a little bit about what we've achieved so far.
Thank you, AJ. And if we could move to the next slide. So AJ's talked a bit about the CEFC's mission and its creation and its governance framework and sources of capital. I wanted to just spend or use 5 slides just to place some of that in a real world context. Starting with the CEFC's performance. So how have we performed since we were created just over 5 years ago? Well, We have committed, as this slide shows, over $5.3 billion in investments. And the combination of the direct financing and indirect financing that we have provided has contributed to emission reductions with emission reductions in the order of 10.8 million tonnes per annum, which correspond to lifetime emission savings in the order of 190 million tonnes. In the most recent financial year specifically, we increased the number and size of our investment commitments to a new record level again. So we made, in the most recent financial year, $2.3 billion in new investment commitments, which was up from $2.1 billion in the previous financial year. In FY18, we also directly committed to 39 projects, which is up from 36 projects in the previous financial year. And you can see from this slide that our investment commitments cover a range of sectors. So $1.1 billion was invested in renewable energy, but we also have investments right across the economy. So $939 million in energy efficiency across the built environment and business and agriculture sectors, $100 million in the transport sector, and $127 million for waste-related projects. So all of this means that, according to the IEA, the CEFC now represents nearly 50% of total investment by green banks around the world to date, which we're very excited about. If we could move to the next slide. And if we just turn quickly now to some of the key principles that have underpinned this investment over time, using returns, and returns in the very broadest sense of the word. Firstly, we always seek to make positive financial returns from our investments, and as a result, we always talk about a commercial approach to investing that requires discipline. And in fact, we have a return target that is currently about 6%. Secondly, we are entirely focused on financing projects and businesses that deliver emission reductions across the Australian economy. And finally, we are constantly thinking about the impact of our investments and the impact that those investments will have on the market, and asking how will our finance drive other investments in that sector and leverage additional capital into clean energy and emission reductions. Sometimes, obviously, we need to make trade-offs between these three, but typically that trade-off will be that we may accept a lower risk-adjusted return if the emission reduction or the market impact is increased. So this is very much what we mean and what AJ alluded to when we talk about investing for public policy purposes. Next slide, please. So if we put that approach into a real-world context, and just by way of reminder before jumping into this slide, as AJ mentioned, Australia has been historically very highly dependent on fossil fuels for electricity generation and its primary energy supply, given that black and brown coal and gas account for about 94% of Australia's primary energy mix. So with that in mind, the next phase in Australia is really about helping to smoothly transition to an energy system with a higher penetration of renewables, taking advantage of all the emerging technologies and accelerating the decarbonisation of the Australian economy. So if we look at this slide now, and starting at the top left, we are focused on supporting the rollout of large-scale solar PV and wind, and we're currently working closely with our clients to implement Australia's first concentrated solar power facility in South Australia as well. With a shift towards increased usage of variable renewables, obviously brings with it a need for smarter transmission infrastructure, as well as firming capacity that can be provided from energy from waste plants or pumped hydro facilities, that can store energy when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, when the sun is not shining. Moving through the slide, we recognise that biofuels have an important role to play as well in reducing emissions, particularly in the transport sector, and we've cornerstoned the establishment of the Australian Bioenergy Fund. We recognise that if we reduce the emissions intensity of the grid, then switching to electric vehicles could be a real game changer for reducing emissions in our transport sector. As a result, we've already invested in one electric vehicle assembly business in Australia and have commissioned research, internal research that we then published publicly to examine where those electric vehicle infrastructure opportunities are in Australia. And then as we shift from the left of this picture, from where electricity is produced to where it is used on the bottom right, our strategy recognises that the important role that energy efficiency has to play in lowering emissions through the construction of lower emissions buildings and infrastructure, like mode switching freight from road to rail. And finally, we have the residential users of electricity on the bottom right. Australia has one of the highest penetrations of rooftop solar in the world, and we expected this to continue. I think we've just now hit 2 million households with rooftop solar. That might not sound like a lot to you depending on the population of your country, but for us it's just over just under 10%, so it's quite a good number. So when we think about these investment opportunities, we think a lot about the technologies of today and tomorrow at the consumer level as well as at the producer level. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the new Joneses. I'm not sure if this saying translates internationally, but the point here is to show how this sort of transition from energy consumers to being active participants in the energy market, and to the extent that we can call them prosumers. Australia, as I mentioned, already has a large penetration of solar PV, rooftop solar PV. And by 2040, Bloomberg New Energy Finance predicts that this behind the meter capacity, including solar and batteries, could contribute to nearly 25% of all electricity generation in Australia. So going forward, we see this very exciting future where households and businesses are smart, they're connected, they're using renewable power. You've got solar PV, batteries, smart appliances, and electric vehicles being assisted by energy management software that will enable households to automatically interact with the grid, contributing generation or reducing demand when needed. However, our infrastructure markets will need to be adapted from those built for central generation to ones that can accommodate decentralised generation. So we expect householders, as this slide conveys, to play an increasingly important role in all of this and as prosumers. And just onto the final slide, please. We just wanted to leave you with this slide to consider, well, for us to consider what our keys to success have been. The attributes that have allowed us to go from zero to more than $5 billion investment over the years. Firstly, as AJ mentioned, we have an expert team, so we invest only in clean energy technologies. So we have this very specialised expertise in-house. Secondly, we make investment decisions independent of government, but these are always informed by our commercial approach. Thirdly, we're constantly seeking to be transformative. We want to be a part of the next big thing that will be transformative, so we seek out, constantly seek out those financing gaps in the market. And finally, we seek to be innovative, and by that I mean we seek to do things differently in order to find a solution where others may not be able to. And the best, just to close, the best example of this is really our willingness and ability to bank projects without long-term power purchase agreements. This remains an area where the private sector is unwilling to take risk, and yet to date we have provided over $1.5 billion to projects with this risk profile. And we can do this, and we've done this by studying the market, understanding it, and taking informed risks. And to date, our returns are healthy and positive. So with that, thank you for listening, and we'll move on to the next presentation.
Thank you, AJ and Bianca. That was really insightful of your 4 years of journey of establishing CEFC. Can we have the next presenter, please? Jonathan first.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, so before I begin the presentation, I'd just like to contextualize how the CFF came about. So there were a number of events that helped motivate or conceptualize the CFF, and those were the decision by the board of the DESA to green the bank, which was taken about a year and a half ago. I think at the time they didn't really understand what greening of the bank meant, but it came on the back of the bank accepting and supporting the UN SDGs and the Paris Accord NDCs. So I think that was an important development within the DBSA. The second one is that there was a recognition by government and by private sector for commercial and practical reasons that the private sector had to get far more involved and needed to start providing utility services, particularly around energy and water. The government, it was always expected the government would do this, but the government realized that the private sector needed to get far more involved, both from a project development point of view, but also from a funding point of view. And then I think the third event was meeting the Coalition for Green Capital at a conference about 2 years ago, where the discussion around green banks came up. So I think our dilemma at the time was that Coalition for Green Capital understood the green bank in a developed world context, but not necessarily in a developing world context. And there are fundamental differences between developed and developing world. Primarily is the source of funding. So green banks in a developed world can be funded by tax money, can be funded by community rates and taxes, and that is not possible in the developing world. So we had to think about what a green bank would look like in a developing world context. So I think the first thing we realized that it should be established within an existing national or regional DFI, such as the DBSA. I think that was very important. The second is to fund or structure the CFF on a blended finance basis, where we could draw upon concessional funding, grant funding, but only grant funding to establish the CFF, not as a source of funding for the CFF. So I think blended finance was a very important one. And fortunately at the time as well, the DBSA had just received its accreditation from the Green Climate Fund. So that was also a very important development in terms of the development of the CFF. So where we are today is that the CFF is now launched. It came together with the approval by the Green Climate Fund about 3 weeks ago to provide concessional funding at a highly concessional rate, which will then be combined with funding from the DBSA and then one of South Africa's largest pension funds. And that collectively is to capitalize by way of debt, a 2 billion rand facility, which is about $160 million, the intention of which is to crowd in or catalyze private sector funding by 3 to 5 times. So what we're hoping to do is to raise funding for projects and businesses in the private sector that mitigate or adapt to climate change. The other important development is that both the pension fund and the GCF have accepted the DVSA's internal credit and investment processes. So we do not have to create separate credit committees, steering committees, advisory committees. So in other words, once it's been approved internally, a funding proposal has been approved internally within the DVSA, it can be funded by the CFF. So I think that what we have done, not consciously, but I think through the process, is that we've created a concept and a way to set up, let's call it green banks in the developing world, using the CFF as a basis for that. So if I then move on to specific mandate of the CFF. So these are what I sort of call the competitive advantages. So the first is most importantly is to play a catalytic role. In other words, to crowd in or catalyze private sector funding, and to do so on a sustainable basis. I think what's very important then, I'll come to it in a little later on, is that we see the source of deal flow coming predominantly from the South African commercial banks, but also from the DVSA itself. We offer 2 products under the CFF, what we call subordinated or first loss funding, which goes between the equity from the sponsored developer and the senior lending from the commercial sector or the commercial funders. We also offer tenor extension, which is particularly relevant given Basel III will kick in 2019. So it's going to be a lot more difficult and expensive for banks to provide long-term funding. And so we're providing a 15-year facility, which can be used by the commercial banks on a co-funded basis to suit the attributes of the project or the business that they're funding. We're also, as I said, leveraging private investment. So we do expect the sponsor developer of projects or businesses that qualify for CFF to put in equity into the projects. And then, of course, we look to co-fund from a number of sources. Next slide. Next. There. So I think we've covered a lot of this in detail already, and I think it was covered very well in the slide that the Coalition for Green Capital put up earlier, where this is showing the leveraging effect and the sources of funding at a high level for the CFF. So it's combining the Green Climate Fund with the DVSA funding, with the PIC funding. This slide is a little bit out of date because at the time AFD we're looking as it's either going to be the PIC or FD. And then this is, of course, crowds in local bank funding as well as project sponsor funding, giving us the 10 billion Rand facility. Next slide, please. This very much talks to the fact that fortunately, the CFF can be managed within the existing infrastructure of the DVSA. So we don't have to set up a green bank per se. The decision has been made to house the CFF within the Product Innovation Unit, which is the unit I'm a member of. And we will in turn create a dedicated team that will look to originate, to process, to administer, and then monitor and report on the projects and businesses that are funded by the CFF. We may have to add to that staff complement as we go along, but certainly in terms of initiating the CFF, we're confident that we have the existing resources to do so. Next slide. There is a list of investment criteria that have been agreed with the Green Climate Fund, as well as the pension fund, as well, of course, the requirements within the DBSA. I think a lot of those investment criteria are already within the DNA of the DBSA, so it's not as though we had to change much. Being a development finance institution, focus around climate mitigation and adaptation is important, obviously is important to us. So is the creation of jobs, so the socio-economic benefits. So a lot of the investment criteria were already part of the DBSA. We didn't have to go out and change much. I think we're going to have to fine tune, and I think we're going to have to develop or amend the way we do things. So just to give you an example, impact measurement is a key focus of the DBSA at the moment, and that's very much related to the amount of what we have to do in terms of monitoring and reporting on the impact from the CFF, in other words, the projects in which it invests in. A lot of these other things we've already covered, but as I said, I must reiterate that fortunately a lot of these criteria are already part of the DBSA's overall requirements and mandate. Next slide. Right, so this is very important because we don't envisage sponsored developers coming directly to the DBSA. The CFF is what I call a reactive fund, in the sense that we will look for deal flow, or we will be referred deal flow from a number of sources, and those sources have been highlighted in this slide. We will always co-fund. We will never fund on our own. And so we see, as I said, a number of sources. These include the DFIs, other DFIs. Within the DBSA itself, we have two units or groups that are relevant. That's our coverage team, as well as our project preparation units. We anticipate referrals coming from such institutions or organizations like the Global Climate Lab. In fact, we're working on one at the moment where they've developed a financial instrument which is just relative to battery-powered transport. It's called PAYS, and we're working with another institution in South Africa in developing battery-powered buses using the PAYS instrument, which was developed in the Global Lab. The main source of deal flow we anticipate will come from the commercial banks and asset managers. Fortunately, in South Africa, we only have 5 commercial banks and probably only 5 or 6 asset managers that have a focus on projects or infrastructure which mitigate or adapt to climate change. In other words, they've set up specialized units within these asset managers. And then what we're thinking about is having an RFP process, but at this stage, that's on hold because we believe the deal flow from the other sources should be strong enough. Next slide. But this is an analysis. I mean, it's a fairly detailed slide, but I think in essence what it's saying is that we anticipate most of the projects to be mitigation related and most of them to be energy related. We see the next secondary category being water, around water efficiency, water treatment, and that's anticipated. I mean, it could change, but basically we had to provide some target when we're putting together our Green Climate Fund application, and based on what we saw as potential deal flow, we felt that this is where the portfolio would probably land up. Next slide. Right, and that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really nice. And we could see that at your end, you are also addressing adaptation projects. That's very nice. Now, we would like to open the floor for questions and discussions with our panelists. To start with, I would like to ask Rob a question. It's about, Rob, you mentioned about different green bank models, and you suggested not one size fits all. I would request if you can help us understand how do a public sector bank go about and select a model. And just before you start, I would like to announce to the participants that you may raise your hand for the question, or you can also type in the chat box and we can read the question for you as you may want. Rob, up to you to answer the question, please.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to our great presenters there. I think, yeah, it's a good question. There is no one size fits all or one single model. And it's certainly, as Jonathan pointed out, in emerging markets and developing countries, it's often going to look much different. I think some key things to keep in mind as you're looking at a green bank type institution or program is, first of all, what are the existing institutions that are there? What are they currently doing? Another key question is what's happening in the markets? Like what are there large market segments, for instance, distributed energy projects or large scale projects, or transmission projects for connecting remote renewables to urban centers. Like what are the actual gaps in the market, and then what are any existing institutions doing, and then that'll kind of help guide the decision making process. Some countries have much more robust existing public national development bank sectors. So Latin America classically has like a very robust national development bank space and a lot of state-owned banks, but the same is also true in a number of other countries as well, in Africa and Asia. And so if there are existing development finance institutions, kind of looking at what their current mandate is, what their current capitalization source allows them to do. Are they tracking things like animating the private sector in the green economy, which some of them are, but many of them are not. And so, sometimes it's as simple as aligning incentives, right? Some of these development finance institutions might have a new goal to increase the amount of their portfolio that's in green, like for under the Paris Agreement, which is good, but that actually can sometimes introduce a perverse incentive for getting the private sector involved, right? So if the DFI has a target of, if they need to get to $1 billion invested in green, if a project comes along that's 100 million, it's in the interest of them to fund that entire project because that gets them closer to their deadline of trying to reach it. If they provide half the financing and the private sector provides the other half, that's actually puts them farther away from their goal. And so kind of aligning incentives properly, and then lining up a good capitalization source, and then getting a strong, governance and operations is really key too. I think CEFC touched on this well, that, having the public sector capitalization, but really a private, getting good private sector staff and people with a private sector mandate on staff in that institution, so it can be run in a financially robust and sustainable way, in a way that proves and demonstrates to the market, is really a key operational challenge for some of these institutions. So those are some of the things to think about. And then, yeah, on the capitalization piece, the Green Climate Fund and a number of other funds are sources that can help you, if you were a country, help you blend your resources in a way and maybe tap into markets where you're currently struggling to, to animate the private sector. So those are other things to think about, is what kind of access to those types of funds do you have? And if you want to discuss more, I'm happy to do it offline. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Just a related question, and I would also encourage participants to ask their questions as well. Related questions to what you suggested. What is the role of the private sector here, and how much do you think the importance of their voice is? What sector they would like to invest in? And does that really give a mandate to Green Bank to focus on certain sector?
Good question. So you're saying what the role of the private sector and shaping this whole thing? I mean, I think it's critically important for a number of reasons, right? One, getting in, sort of ex-private sector people, entrepreneurial, financially savvy people into these institutions is key to get them to run well. But engaging early with the private sector to understand what the market gaps are is really important too. I think in the South Africa example, we spent a lot of time speaking with the commercial banks in South Africa, with developers, with a number of market players there in the private sector to understand, the state of the market. Jonathan, maybe you could kind of touch on some of the roadshows and work we did with the commercial banks in South Africa.
Yeah, Jonathan, good to hear from you on that.
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. We would love to hear from you on your experience.
Yeah, so I think what has happened is, quite interestingly, is that we didn't have to do much selling, because what has happened is South Africa has one of the most successful renewable energy, independent power producer renewable energy programs. And I think it's been recognized as such. So what had happened is the banks had all staffed up these units to deliver on the renewable energy program. And it faltered for a while, and I won't go into the reasons why. And what happened is that the banks then realized they'd set up these dedicated units. They were costly, they were well staffed, and they realized that there were opportunities beyond the government program, the government-led program, for projects in the private sector. So then they started predominantly in the renewable energy, the solar renewable energy space. They started funding projects in the private sector, but a little bit also in the water space. So but they were struggling. I think if you go back to some of Rob's slides where he shows where the Green Bank can assist in terms of its catalyzation role, what they realized that there were various obstacles or challenges, such as technology, such as early stage, such as diversified sources of payment. And then when we came along and spoke to them about the concept of a CFF, they said this is exactly the kind of facility that we could use to roll out private sector projects on a far larger scale. So I think we were very fortunate is that the momentum in South Africa already commenced fortuitously for us. And so as I said, when we went to present the CFF, they really thought it was an excellent idea. And in fact, for our GCF application, we had to demonstrate deal flow, and the banks provided us with, I think it was close to 19 transactions, which could use the CFF if it was available. So I think we could demonstrate that there is deal flow existing in which the CFF can be utilized.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to invite Henny Shalaby, who has requested with a good question, what are the essential ingredients to become a green bank? And maybe all the panelists could help answer this question one by one. Maybe Rob, you could start.
Sure. Yeah, good question. So, I mean, quickly, essential ingredients, I think, you know, a source of patient capital, you know, or a balance sheet that can be used in a way that has some kind of public or blended source to allow you to invest with some flexibility. So a source of capital is really important. A really strong team with good people. I think independence from government. So we often call these institutions public or quasi-public. So having some public sector involvement in terms of capitalization or being able to provide a feedback loop to government, but importantly, independence, so that you don't have government bureaucrats picking investment projects is a really key criteria. And, you know, I think, I mean, you know, if you got the team and you've got the capital and you've got good independence, those would be the three things I would highlight, but I'm sure there's more if you want to take it away. Maybe AJ or Bianca from the Australia perspective.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I'd just echo what you said and just add as well that, as you mentioned at the start, there's many different types of green banks. So in our particular case at the CEFC, what has worked is being independent of government, is taking a commercial approach to our investments. And as we discussed, all of our investments, or most of our investments require us to make a commercial return. I guess also important to mention that taking an innovative approach and looking to push the boundaries is also very important because, you know, it's part of our role to find those gaps in the market, but those gaps obviously get filled over time. And so a successful green bank is a green bank that can stay ahead of the curve and continue to look for those gaps and provide solutions where the private sector isn't already active. AJ, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more.
I think that's, you know, what I would consider the key or essential ingredients. You know, all those things that Rob and Bianca have touched on. But maybe to throw one more in there, I think, you know, this objective-focused organisation, you know, the fact that we're not typically, and Rob might correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I know of any green banks that has profit maximisation as one of their objectives. I think whilst we have a commercial approach, we want to make positive returns. That's not our key purpose for existing. You know, our key purpose is emissions reductions or you know, climate change adaptation. Things like that are front and centre, and generating enough profits to pay the bills and make a reasonable return for our shareholders is important, but I think that's a second order consideration. And for me, I think that's a real differentiator and a real enabler of the green bank model.
Thank you, AJ. And AJ and Bianca, we have a question specifically for you, asking, this has been asked by Mark Claw. I hope I'm able to take the name properly. And his question is, does CEFC have any mandate or intention to invest in offshore projects, for example, in Pacific?
Sorry, DT, did you say, for example, in the Pacific?
No, for example, in Pacific.
So
do they mean outside
questions around offshore investment?
Yeah, this is about the offshore projects. So if you just can touch upon the offshore projects. And we also have a question from Lisa about whether CFF or DESA would like to finance the municipalities on different projects. And she also asked about non-motorized transport projects as an example.
Maybe I jump in first on the offshore financing. So under our investment mandate and our legislation, we are restricted to investing in projects or businesses that are mainly or solely Australian based. So we're not able to invest directly in, say, a wind farm or a solar project outside of Australia.
Thank you, AJ. Would you like to touch upon about cities and about non-motorized transport projects as well as adaptation projects that does not generate cash? This has been asked by DESA.
For us or for ADT?
Yes, Bianca, this is for you as well as Jonathan. Both examples from Australia and Africa, she would love to know.
Certainly. So in terms of working with, starting with municipalities, we do have a local government platform. So that platform exists and targets local municipalities in Australia to help them both better understand and be able to finance low carbon activities in their jurisdictions. So some of those activities can include energy efficient streetlights, can include small scale solar and batteries, and we have a specialised platform to provide information and finance to municipalities and local governments in Australia. Some of those local governments do include the City of Melbourne in Australia, and we've done a range of financing activities for the City of Melbourne. Don't know if AJ you wanted to touch on that more, but that's certainly an area for us to target reducing emissions across various different sectors from renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Thank you, Bianca. Jonathan, would you like to share your experience about financing adaptation projects?
Yeah, so I think it's still very early days in terms of the DVSA. However, the CFF is targeted towards the private sector. And only recently has the private sector started to provide utility services which were previously provided by the government. The DESA is the largest lender to the municipal space in South Africa. And that's it's one of our main part of our mandates. So when we have been funding municipalities to develop projects or upgrade or refurbish projects, we have looked at both mitigation and adaptation as part of the sort of ESG assessment of those projects. So I think just on adaptation, as far as the CFF is concerned, it's only just started.
Thank you, Jonathan. There is a related question to you as well. Can NGOs apply for financing of projects aimed at developing commercial bioenergy projects in Africa and Southeast Asia?
Can the CFF be used in... Okay, so the CFF is a RAND facility, and it's only open to countries that make up what we call the Common Monetary Union, which is Swaziland, Namibia, Lesotho, and South Africa. So I can say that I am very against dollar funding for Africa, because it creates risks which makes it very difficult for African countries to service the loans. So one of the reasons for making it a RAND facility is we took the currency risk, particularly around what we call convertibility and availability, out of the equation. We have discussed setting up a CFF for other countries within Africa, but my personal view is that, and this is one that I think Coalition supports, we would prefer it if DFIs in a country or a region within Africa set up a local currency CFF in that country or region, because every single country in Africa has a local debt capital markets. It has a pension fund, it has life companies, and it has banks. And it would be a pity not to tap into that funding to set up a CFF in those countries and rather to borrow in dollars. Because the problem you have is that they invest in projects that return local currency, and now you have to find the dollars to pay back the lenders. So unless a CFF is totally grant funded, which in my view is not sustainable, it is best to try and do a CFF using the local debt capital markets, and very much along the basis that we've developed in South Africa, or should I say parts of Southern Africa.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just to announce, we have 20 more minutes to go, and we have a few questions also to answer. The next question comes from Fiona Wren, and the question is, what about the importance of having an expertise in clean energy, which was important for CEFC and also in a Ukraine Green Bank? I guess AJ and Bianca, you would like to respond to this?
Sure. I mean, I think, yeah, one of the things that we touched on, I think, in our presentation was when we talk about the expertise within our organisation. You know, it's a mix of energy sector expertise as well as financial sector expertise, and we do think that that's one of the unique things about our organisation. I mean, unique, say, compared to a commercial banking enterprise. But perhaps not unique for green banks. But yeah, I think you know, the ability to have people on staff who are experts in energy, working day in, day out and side by side with people from the finance sector, you know, working up solutions to problems that you know, typically, you know, those two groups wouldn't necessarily work together day in, day out. I think you know, we've been able to bring that expertise together, and as an organisation, we've really benefited from that. So, you know, I think that is an important part of the mix. And I should say that's not just around renewable energy; it's also in built environment, so energy efficiency. You know, bringing people on board who have expertise in you know, engineering and building design, who can help us pull apart how we might apply our capital in a sensible way that drives energy efficiency outcomes in the built environment. So it's broader than just experts in renewable energy.
Thank you, AJ. We have one of our colleagues who has been raising hand. Penny, would you like to ask question? Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, go ahead, please, with your question.
Oh, sorry. I thought I could hear you. I don't know if anyone else is on the line though.
Yeah, we are all in line. Can you please ask your question?
Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, please go ahead. Okay, I guess there's some miscommunication. We are not able to hear. I would ask the next question, which has come from Nicola Ross, and this is for either Jonathan or AJ, Bianca, or maybe Rob, you can answer as well. The question is, are you using SDGs as the framework to guide where you provide finance, or do you map finance activities back to them afterwards based on your own strategy? Jonathan, would you like to go on it first? Sure.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, I will do that for you. So the question is, are you using SDGs as one of the framework to guide and provide finance to the project, or you are connecting to them after the financing activities have done, and you're trying to identify which are the SDGs being addressed by the financed project?
Okay, so what we did as part of the process, we identified which SDGs would be supported through the CFF, and I think we identified 7 or 8, and then we used those 7 or 8 to frame the investment criteria. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I would like to unmute Nicole. Nicola, I hope that answers your question, or would you like to ask again?
No, yes, can you hear me? Thank you, that
Yes.
answers my question.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, no, that answers my question. I'm from a bank myself, and we're busy going through a process of aligning our strategy to SDGs or vice versa. So I was just curious how you went about tracking which SDGs you are contributing to.
Thank you, Nicola. AJ and Bianca, would you like to respond to that? And after that, I would like to call upon Rob, if you can also reflect your views on it.
Sure, Aditi. So when our Act was crafted a number of years ago, it didn't explicitly mention the SDGs, but it's certainly something that we consider when we make our investments, and that's just a natural part of our investment cycle. There's some of the SDGs that are, I guess, more relevant to our investments than others. So obviously affordable clean energy is very relevant, as is the SDG relating to water, as is the SDG relating to biodiversity. So there's some that are you know, key parts of our due diligence process, even though they're not, the SDGs aren't explicitly mentioned in our Act.
Thank you. Rob, would you like to reflect?
Sure, yeah, quickly. So, I mean, I think, you know, the SDGs are an important driver for, you know, crafting a mandate or investment criteria. But I think a key takeaway from this whole thing, I think, should be the focus on local institutions designed for local needs and local goals and priorities, right? So there's each of these examples are based within their own local market, in their own local currency, and responding to the needs of the those local markets, and they're driven sort of, or at least at a high level, crafted by, you know, policymakers and leaders within those local markets, right? So we're not talking, you know, there's plenty of global funds out there, or you could talk about the Green Climate Fund in some ways is almost like a global green bank. But, you know, a local institution is going to be good at assessing risk of projects, at, you know, enmeshing itself within the local finance community, and importantly responding to, you know, the goals, and whether those are SDG goals or climate goals or what have you. I think it's really important that it be driven by the local stakeholders. So you know, that's another thing about there's no one model. Some places might have a much larger focus on, you know, if it's an area with a large coastline, then coastal resilience is going to be a big part of it. If it's a place with a lot of biomass material left over from certain processing activities, then that's going to be a big focus. So I think it's important that there's not just sort of one metric of SDGs or only climate that gets decided somewhere in Brussels or in Korea, and that's going to be the way that every institution needs to work. I mean, I think they need to be responsive to the local goals, whether they're SDG goals or climate goals of the local market that they're created within.
Thank you, Rob. I would like to unmute Lisa, who has raised her hand and she would like to ask a question. Lisa, go ahead, and this might be the last question we would like to take.
Oh, actually, in fact, my questions were answered already. I was typing them in, so that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else would like to ask any question? No one? So I believe we have been able to respond to most of the questions that has been asked by the participants, and we would like to thank the presenters from Australia, AJ and Bianca. I know this is quite late for you. Thank you so much, Rob. This is quite early hours for you, and of course, Jonathan, this is midday for you. So thank you so much to all the presenters and also all the attendees. From Asia-Let's Partnership, we would like to thank you for joining for this webinar, and we look forward to interact with you and engage with you further for many such webinars to come. We would request you to keep looking for information on further webinars and information materials and tools and detail about these presentations and how you can connect with the presenters, their coordinates at our website of Asia-Let's Partnership. We would be handing over these handouts there as well, and you can further ask questions to our panelists through us. Thank you so much, and with this, we would like to close this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.